Chapter 6 is about long-term memory structure. In the textbook, you will see it discusses the difference between division and interaction, and that is the theme of Chapter 6. We are going to first talk about division, meaning how do we know the difference between short-term memory and long-term memory. Last week we talked about short-term memory, and this week we will focus on long-term memory. Long-term memory is an archive of information about past events and knowledge learned. It does work closely with working memory in that, as we discussed before, once you have rehearsed a particular memory enough, it will enter into your long-term memory. Storage can stretch back just from a few minutes ago, and it can go as far back as your 5th birthday party. We're going to look at what that looks like on a timeline. And of course, research has shown us that more recent memories are more detailed, so we can recall more aspects of recent memories. In this illustration, you will see how far back one's memory can go. So we have a gentleman here, I believe his name is Tony, I'm not sure. He is sitting in class, but what was happening before that? So he remembers that 5 minutes ago he was walking to class. Yesterday he went shopping for clothing. Then he recalls maybe a bit further back and thinks, oh, Jim and I went to the football game last week. He can also then remember a year ago he started college, and he might remember elementary school 10 years ago. Everyone's first memory is going to be different, but we can recall as far back as our childhood. The serial position experiments that I'm about to go through with you have demonstrated a few things. So Murdoch, 1962, first started this task where you read a list of words, and then you have to remember as many as you can and write down those words. And there were 20 words given. What he found was there was both a primacy effect and a recency effect. If you look at page 154 in your textbook, you will see a list of words, and you can get a better idea of what that would look like to give someone that list of 20 words. The idea behind the primacy effect is that you have time to rehearse those words in the beginning, and then once you're presented with more in the middle, you have less of your attention able to dedicate to that, and then the recency effect occurs because you have most recently heard those words. So we have a few different iterations of this serial position task. And this curve you can see on this page is a reflection of what happened when they provided a more opportunity to rehearse the words. So if you look at the red curve, that is the same curve you saw on the previous page. If you look at the blue triangles, that will track what happens when you're able to remember those first words better. That's your recency effect. But then, because you have rehearsed those and kept those in your memory, the recency effect is eliminated. But you still have the primacy effect there. It also enters your long-term memory in that situation. So we're looking at the difference between short-term memory and working memory and how that is put into long-term memory. On this particular slide, excuse me, there is a delay after the list is read, and that eliminates the recency effect. So you are thinking about those first words, you might be rehearsing them, you then get to the end of the list and you're told you have to wait for 30 seconds before you can write any of them down. They have found that eliminates the recency effect. There are also different types of coding that occur in long-term memory, and I'm going to review those now. You can also refer to page 159, and I will go over a summary of this. So there is visual and auditory encoding that happens in both short and long-term memory. There also is semantic encoding, as we talked about semantic meaning having meaning to you. The encoding happens in both short and long-term memory as well. So this one experiment by Wickens in 1976 shows a few different things. So in that first group, you'll see all of the stimuli presented were fruits. So the subjects were presented with the names of the fruits, and then they had to recall them after a delay with some interference. As they got to the later trials, they had a lot of fruits in their mind, so they were not able to remember as many. I'm going to show you the next slide so you can see that particular graph on the left. So you can see that there was interference that occurred because of the fruit names being presented. In trial B, in the section B there, you can see that the first 3 trials have professions listed. So there would be proactive interference with each profession, with each list of professions presented. But then, when they introduced fruit in trial 4, they found that there was good memory for the fruits, and you can see that on the graph on the right with trial 4 with the F for fruits. So this demonstrates proactive interference, and it also demonstrates that relationship between short-term memory and long-term memory, how your information about the fruits is getting into your long-term memory because there was interference in that during that delay. For semantic encoding, one of the experiments that is most commonly referred to is Sachs in 1967. He had participants read a passage, and then he measured recognition memory. So we did also last week talk about the difference between recall and recognition. So if you recall, recognition is being able to acknowledge that you have seen the item that's presented to you before. So Sachs would present a sentence and would say, "Did you see this exact sentence before?" And the participants had to say yes or no. And what he wanted to know was whether they remembered the exact phrases or just the general plot. And what he found, and you can refer to this on page 159 in your textbook as well, he did find that people had the general gist of the plot, but did not necessarily recognize the exact phrases. So that tells us that we code for meaning. We don't necessarily look at things verbatim or remember things verbatim, but we can assess the meaning of a situation or passage and recognize that. This last slide is important, and it will appear on the exam in some type of way. This is the 3 different types of codes. So you have the visual, auditory, and semantic coding from short-term memory and long-term memory. And this tells you the difference between what happens in short-term memory and long-term memory. So this is one that you can look at and study so that you make sure you understand the difference. I'll give you one example. So if you are looking at the auditory section, in short-term memory, you are representing the sounds in your mind. So let's also think about a siren going by is often my example. You might be able to recall the sound of that siren. And it also is something that from long-term memory, you have encountered that likely many times before, and you can recognize the difference between perhaps an ambulance siren and a fire truck siren because you have some long-term memories stored of those experiences. So that is the section about short-term versus long-term memory and giving that division there, and we'll resume with some other memory topics.